Mr. Narendra Modi is back in the saddle as Prime Minister after a decisive win in the 2019 elections. The political win aside, the economy, we know now, is in poor shape, and more economists are predicting a bumpy journey downhill after the next 5 years. We will also talk about the legislative process and see how such a huge win is likely to impact decisions in Parliament. Hello and welcome to Parley. My name is Anuradha Raman and I'm joined by Rathin Roy, Director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and Member, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, and M.R. Madhavan, who is the President and co-founder of PRS Legislative Research, a public policy research institute that focuses on making the legislative process transparent and more focused. Rathin, I'll begin with you. Last week, you had rung the alarm bells on the economy front, although you had written articles before that in an interview to NDTV, wherein you said, and may I assume here that we are actually caught between the frying pan and the fire. And all the development and all the economy, what has been fueling the economy are 10 crore Indians who appear to be now exhausted or probably are reaching an exhaustion point. Would you like to explain the bump?
It's not a bump, regrettably. Actually, if you look at the state of the economy in the short term, we've had fairly sound macroeconomics over the last 5 years. So our fiscal deficits are not as low as I would like, but reasonably have been under control. Inflation is low, and the balance of payments, the current account deficit is reasonably under control. I don't tend to get alarmed by short-term ups and downs. So that's not the problem. The trouble is a more long-term one, and it's a bipartisan problem. It's a consequence of the way we have grown over the last 25, 28 years, which is that we certainly haven't been an export-led economy so far. And like Gandhi said about Western civilization, it would be a good idea, but it hasn't happened. I'm presuming that it will not happen going forward. I welcome, increased exports, but you're not going to make the Indian economy rich by exporting. So you're going to make it rich by basically producing what people in India consume. And the trouble has been that so far we have been meeting the consumption demands of those who have been becoming more and more affluent over the last 28 years, and that is the top 100 to 150 million Indians, which is why when you go to Bombay and you look at what they call leading indicators, you hear four-wheelers, two-wheelers, air conditioners, fast-moving consumer goods. And you and I very well know that this is not what all of India consumes. This is what some Indians consume. Now, so far it was okay because with 150 million is a big market. It's a bigger market than Germany. So growth was powering on just fine. But what I'm noticing now is that this consumption demand is beginning to plateau. It had to happen one day. You've all bought your cars. We've all bought our air conditioners. Now the increased discretionary consumption is going into more things like foreign holidays, Italian kitchens, etc., which by definition cannot form the consumption basis for India. Therefore, we really have to now think about how, without subsidy, the next 200-300 million, their consumption can be the spur for growth going forward. And what do they consume? They consume what we consume: a nutritious meal, clothing. They would like to consume a house, that is, buy one house in their lifetime, decent health, decent education. So what I've been saying is that unless we are now able to move away from this four-wheeler, two-wheeler, air conditioner-based economy to an economy where these things are produced at affordable prices, we will begin to peter out in our growth, and I wouldn't like that because there's huge potential in the Indian economy to change the composition of growth such that our growth is sustainable and we complete our development transformation. I want to say one final thing. I said without subsidy. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because if you're looking at the top 300-400 million of the population, I'm looking effectively at people who earn at least the minimum wage or more. It is not tenable to subsidize 85% of the population when the next 30% is actually earning the minimum wage. These things we have to produce for them affordably without subsidy, because there is that 600 million behind for whom we need the subsidy. So that's our economic challenge going forward, and a big thing has been made. the shift in rhetoric and emphasis from thinking of agriculture as a place where we maximize output to doubling farmers' income. That's very positive. Very good things have happened with affordable housing in the last tenure of this government. And beginning has happened on healthcare. So I'm quite confident that the sort of plateauing of India's growth story, which is what I'm afraid of in the medium term, we have 5 to 10 years to deal with this, can be avoided, and economic actions to do so must be put in place.
So please explain this. The 1.2 billion Indians that you're talking about who are outside this 100 crore people who consume all the durables that you talked about. Affordable housing has been a policy with almost all governments, if you're going to talk about from 1991 onwards. Housing, particular emphasis was placed on affordable housing. Nutrition, again, we have had several programs targeting this very population that you're talking about. So where have we, you said a beginning has also been made.
Affordable housing has, until this government increased the scale and attention paid to affordable housing, it was essentially given to people with subsidy. Now here's my proposition. I think, thank you for asking me this question. If you're earning, let's say, twice the minimum wage in Delhi, that would mean you would be earning approximately 16 to 18,000 rupees a month. Right? Now if you are earning 16 to 18,000 rupees a month over a 30-year period, what is the likelihood that you will be able to buy from the market a housing unit with secure land title and the amenities that one would consider minimum for someone earning the minimum wage? I think the probability is very low, otherwise we would not have people earning more than the minimum wage in the slums of urban India. And therefore the affordable housing has to be something that is produced by market forces, earning 15% return. And yes, in affordable housing, I think where we do need to help, because it's skewed in India, is we need to make sure that we take land out of the equation. That has happened all over the world. There's plenty of land. The housing minister was first to say so. There's plenty of land available with the government of India and its entities that is surplus. But the land that we have given away, public land, such as this building in which I'm sitting, your offices, has not gone for housing. It has gone to media companies, it has gone to group cooperative housing societies, it has gone to gymkhana clubs, it has gone to almost everything, except to provide for minimum wage. So I'm saying if you take land and repurpose its use and provide modest but decent housing to people who earn the minimum wage through the market without subsidy and earn 15% return, that process will be job intensive and it will get you growth. With agriculture, it's interesting. Yes, we have talked about nutrition, but I challenge any economist in this country to tell me in any part of the country what the non-subsidized price of a nutritious meal is. The non-subsidized price. They won't be able to. So we really need, that's why this doubling farmers' income initiative of the previous government is so important, because we are saying, okay, if we double farmers' income, then it is reasonable that they don't need subsidy. Then if the farming business is going to earn a 15% rate of return, what will price of a nutritious meal be? And at what level of wage will those not producing food be able to afford it? Right? So this is the kind of economic calculus that we have to start doing. With textiles, it is a different matter. The upmarket textiles, such as probably the shirt that Madhavan has wearing.
High-end brands.
Yeah, they are 95% made in India. But if you go to a Sarojini Nagar or Fashion Street and try and buy a 400 rupee shirt, many of them are made in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Now, Bangladesh and Vietnam are not China. So how come we are uncompetitive with Bangladesh and Vietnam? The answer I get is not that we are technology uncompetitive, but we are wage uncompetitive. How are we wage uncompetitive? Wages in UP, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Orissa are not much higher, or not higher in fact, than Bangladesh or Vietnam. And then look at the transport costs. But wages in South Gujarat are, wages in Tirupura. So the question there really is a profound one. We are not able to make textiles in our country and do import substitution and thereby raise growth. That's effectively exports, right? Because we are unable to actually locate industries where wages are low. And thereby we are also increasing regional inequality, because if you ask the question, if I may, I often like to ask this, that since 1991, what has been the major benefit to Eastern UP, Bihar and Jharkhand of economic growth? There has been a benefit. And that benefit has been through migration to the south and the west. So we have 4 flights a day now, 5, sorry, from Bhubaneswar to Bangalore. And those are full of coders. They're not full of CEOs. There's no business class on that plane. And that's good. But that's a small minority. It's an appreciable number, but a small minority of the number of people who are emigrating. The rest, who use the great Indian railways, are serving effectively as cooks and drivers and security guards of people in the south and the west and in the NCR. So for them it is like a third-rate Dubai. And we have to change this. These structural changes are what I'm pointing to as both barriers to India's growth story going forward if we continue with business as usual, and huge opportunities to transform the economy if we understand that not doing business as usual is both possible and urgent.
So from 1991, since you said this is respective governments have not really focused on the structural shifts that need to be made, what, I mean, are you saying that we do not have proper policy makers? I mean, where does really the fault lie actually?
No, it's quite logical when you start any development enterprise. So if you look at if I may go even further back and break up the objective of the development state in India since 1947 or 1950, I would say from 1950 to about 1971, the objective was self-reliance. And we succeeded. We built above our pay grade. We built space stations, we built engineering industries, etc. From 71 onwards, I'd say till the late 90s, towards the end of the 80s, the objective was to continue with modernization, but also to end poverty and hunger. And we succeeded in substantial measure. From 1991 onwards, macroeconomic stability became very important as the world globalized, old foreign relations broke down, and so what we had to do was find our place in the growth story. That was consistent with some economic liberalization, which was not terribly inequitous and more important, was successful at least at significantly transforming the lives of the first 150 million Indians. And we did that quite substantially. And then I would like to think of the period from 2004 till about 2000 till very recently as the period when we tried to, we began to recognize that productive inclusion is not happening, by which I mean people are not contributing in the business of producing growth. Right. Hence, we had Narega, hence we had this massive outreach to improve capabilities through SSA, etc. They've had mixed results. Now I'm saying, and this is why I have been uncomfortable with things like Nyay, that the development state needs to continue the business of development. Nyay, or a universal basic income, to keep it apolitical, is not development. It is compensation for the failure to do what I'm suggesting we do, which is get people to participate in growth. But there's a limited amount of participation you will get from Indians if we are going to produce things that only the top 100 million consume. Just think of the 5 things I've said. I've not mentioned the word jobs. They're jobful. Second and more important, in a society that is constrained by the lack of skills and capabilities, these 5 things are not rocket science. I can do them in UP and Bihar and Chhattisgarh and Orissa, but with a moderate increase in skills. And third, they involve producing what people want where they are. So we make the Indian growth process broad-based, we include people, and by doing this, by choosing the activities that do this, my submission is, you will solve what you see as the macroeconomic problem, but is really only a symptom, which is high unemployment, unbalanced growth, etc.
You also mentioned that if we don't look at these things, we are going to probably end up with Brazil and South Africa in an interview.
Yes, that was of course rhetorical, but I did want to point out something that is not rhetorical. If you're a student of history and you look at the history of post-war development in this world, you have Japan, South Korea, I'm ignoring the smaller countries, and now China, who you can say have been growing such that now they have transformed the lives of the majority of the population, and now they're actually looking to improve them. That's what I call a development transformation, right? But if you look at countries like Brazil, South Korea, China, Indonesia, they have not done so. Despite the per capita income of Brazil being 4 times what it is in India, there is endemic poverty in Brazil, high insecurity, high crime. So there are 2 development stories. And a linear growth path may not actually lead you to a development transformation. So we have to choose what growth path we want, and I firmly believe, since I've worked in Brazil and I've seen it firsthand, that what we need to do is get productive inclusion into the economy. Productive inclusion means you say, how do people participate in growth? And if it's either their regional location, or their gender, or their ethnicity, or their capabilities inhibits that, then you fix that. But that process of participation must begin. And you don't wait for capabilities to improve. Otherwise, the gulf will keep on increasing. We know this. The gulf between the ability of, let's say, UP and Bihar and Jharkhand and Odisha to spend public money effectively and, let's say, the southern states is growing, because each year, when the southern states spend it better, the gulf becomes wider. And this we've got to stop. We've got to correct for this. So it is this dimensional sense that I'm making.
And when you're talking about two narratives of development happening, is that what we can understand in our Indian context when the government says we are really on a fast growth, but what you are saying is there are two different growth stories?
There is a growth story that we have been pursuing in the past. And that has made us richer, and it has reduced poverty to some extent. But that growth story most spectacularly today for two reasons. One, demonstrable inequality in many dimensions. And two, the inability of the north and the east, where the majority of people live, to claim a share, even if by example in that growth story. These two things are things that we will need to address going forward. Persisting with the old growth story will not address them, because these are consequences of that growth story. So what I'm arguing for, therefore, is a shift in the composition of output, but through the markets, which is why I keep emphasizing we need to find out how to make these things at affordable prices. So if somebody earning 15,000 rupees a month minimum wage, I need to be able to get that person a house, which is maybe 4 years salary, just to give you an example. So what's 4 years salary of 15,000? 7 lakhs. I need low-cost housing, where some private entrepreneur can produce this, taking outside the land cost, and that 7 lakhs include that person's 15% return, and the EMI profits, the two sides to it, that this person will have to pay without subsidy. Without subsidy. Because you will need that subsidy for the rest. Because the country will not wait for the 300 million to prosper before the next 700 million prospers. This will go a long way. So always remember, I'm not against subsidy, I'm just saying there is something wrong with the economic arithmetic of any country where people who earn the minimum wage or twice the minimum wage can't go to the market, buy these 5 basic things and come home. And that we got to fix.
Madhavan, what does this huge political win, how is this going to play out in Parliament?
So clearly the Parliament structure of Lok Sabha in terms of parties has not had a major change. And the BJP on its own had a majority. It has a slightly larger majority on its own, and with NDA has a very comfortable majority. And the opposition largest party, which is the Congress, remains the largest party and still remains without a leader of opposition because it doesn't hit the 10% mark. Okay. So that's what is worrying me, and it's nothing to do with this parliament or this government or the last government, but a structure which has built up. I would say 1985 was the break point. And the reason I'm saying 1985 is when I would say our constitution came into force on 26th January 1950, and in 52 our first parliament came in, and 1985 we ended the parliamentary system of Indian government by passing something called the anti-defection law. Okay. We do not have a parliament. We have a set of bosses who tell everybody under them to vote in a particular way on pain of being kicked out of parliament. Okay. And at least when there was, so 85 to 90 was bad, 89. After that, at least when there were coalition governments, you needed to convince your at least a half a dozen other people of what you wanted to do. But whenever you have a single majority government, you don't need to convince anybody. You can press a button, and that button carries a weight of more than 50%. So one huge check has gone. And this goes against everything that a parliamentary democracy stands for. Why do we have a parliament? What's the idea of a parliament? It is that there is a legitimacy by representatives discussing in public issues and reaching some sort of a consensus, which is, there are always conflicting interests. How do you find a path through those conflicting interests is a discussion which is supposed to happen in parliament. And then the voting is supposed to happen. And at least I would say there are two, I mean, what is an MP supposed to do? There are two very broad thoughts, right? One is the Edmund Burke argument that I'm not supposed to do what is exactly my constituents have asked me to do. I'm not representing just the people in my constituency, but the larger national interest. Or you could say that these guys have voted me, so I include it. But by no means am I supposed to only represent the political party on which ticket I stood, which is what we have ended up. So we have taken away one check. Other thing which has happened is at least there is another check which had developed from 93 onwards, which went off in the last 5 years, which is the committee system. We still have committees. Committees were behaving in a reasonably non-partisan manner. They were discussing bills, coming out with good recommendations. They continue to do that in the last 5 years with one major issue, which is that only 25% of bills were referred to committees. So what has happened now is, where are the checks and balances that on the executive? It's not coming through Parliament in the floor of the House, because by definition in Lok Sabha the government has a majority. I mean, whoever has the majority has the government. So individual MPs are not able to check because their votes are owned by the government of the day. Committees were forming some sort of a check. For example, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code, they at least gave a number of recommendations which were put in. The Consumer Protection Act, it had a number of issues. For example, it had product liability, included goods, missed out services. It was a technical goof up, but at least the committee corrected that. That won't happen on the floor of the House because they are not looking into it in detail. Now, we are not referring that many to committees. I hope that the new Parliament, they start looking at that again. And the other check, because of the way the composition of Parliament was in the last few years. In fact, it's really interesting that in the last 20 years or so, when we have had changes of government, during Mr. Vajpayee's prime ministership, that NDA did not have a majority in Rajya Sabha. Okay. During the 10 years of UPA did not have a majority in Rajya Sabha. During NDA, I don't know what to call it, NDA 1, 2, 3, whatever, during 2014 to 19, the NDA did not have majority in Rajya Sabha. But that could change, I think by the end of 2020, they will be almost very close to majority. I mean, they'll have at least 45% of the seats in Rajya Sabha, and that's pretty good enough to manage that. So we are losing the checks. One possible way forward is, if, and that's a big if, and you need the buy-in, it has to be initiated in a way by the new government and the Prime Minister, is to actually do something audacious and which addresses some of the things, possibly addresses some of the things that Rathin was pointing out, of inequality within the country, which is to say that we are an extremely diverse country, and therefore the way to handle whatever works for Kerala is unlikely to work for UP, and therefore say that the central government and Parliament will go back to the original constitutional mandate, look at the 7th schedule and say that we will do things strictly only union list, we will do concurrent list issues, only a skeletal framework, leave it to the states, and don't touch anything in state list. For example, health. The central government has no business coming out with any schemes on health. It can collect tax money, pass it on to states and decide, let them decide, do they want to do health? Do they want to do land? Do they want to do agriculture? It is their business. That's at least what the constitution had originally envisaged. So let's get slightly more federal, and that possibly could be a way forward. That because the more local you get, the easier it is to target your needs. So I hope somebody looks at it. I hope at least, the constitutional body which is looking at these things, which is the Finance Commission currently, which is supposed to give its report by the end of, is scheduled to give it by the end of October, also makes some of these recommendations, because its mandate is division of money between center and states. How does it do that?
You said you were worried by the numbers. I'm also, I wanted to ask you, since this election looked like a presidential form of election, does that also add to your worries? Are we?
That doesn't, in a way, in the sense, see, it is for each political party and each politician to play the election the way it would benefit them the most. It is for the people to decide what benefits them the most. Okay. So I would not say that, but it is, if somebody else wants to put a different narrative, there is nothing that stopped them from doing that. So that's fine. I mean, that will happen always. But we as citizens should also think that who are we voting for? Are we voting to get among the slate of people who are there on that ballot box the best person to be a parliamentarian, or are we voting for the Prime Minister and therefore a particular party and not looking at who is this person, who is the candidate? I think people don't do that, because the amount, at least one never knows this, but circumstantial evidence, which is the amount of effort parties take, even the BJP, which won so well, in deciding which candidate from which constituency. They change their candidates. Why would they bother to change if the candidate did not matter? So clearly, they think the candidate also matters, party also matters. There is a bunch of different factors that matters to be able to win the seat.
Rathin, if I were to ask you, what are the first few steps that Mr. Modi should do to help the economy on the economic front? What would your 4 points be for this?
The first things would be short term. And they would be, we have to get our fundamentals right. We have the macroeconomy, which has three parts: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and balance of payments. On the monetary policy front, in 2021, the mandate of the Monetary Policy Committee ends. So we need to have a national conversation on the record with respect to the inflation band. We have succeeded very nicely in keeping inflation under control. We have an institutional framework now, but this is the time to ask, what are the trade-offs involved in keeping inflation here? And, are we measuring the right kind of inflation? What kind of empowerment we want to give the Monetary Policy Committee with respect to the repo rate, because that has an impact on the cost of government borrowing and therefore constrains the fisc. On the fiscal side, I've been arguing for a long time, I hope this is done, should have been done 20 years ago. We are the only G20 country that does annual budgeting. Annual budgeting is not headful and is a major reason for the low productivity and predictability of government spending and revenue collection. We need to move to a medium-term expenditure framework, a medium-term fiscal framework, and that will take about 2 years, so it's an immediate task we start on. And we need to move into a medium-term fiscal framework where we actually have baselines for fiscal prudence. So my baseline for fiscal prudence is the total revenue GDP ratio today. I would like us to assume it doesn't go up. And then we say, what are we going to finance with this revenue GDP ratio? Number one, if it goes up, then what are we going to additionally finance? And that immediately tells you, therefore, how much borrowing you can do. So this is very important. Second, there are three major areas of the central government. There's a central government election, where the central government spends money, which is directly and following Madhavan, solely responsible for it. They are called defense, internal security, and railways. These are big spending areas. We need to have a review of what are going to be the defense spending needs in these three areas over the next 9 years, and pre-commit that into the budgeting cycle. Third, on credit policy. We have an extremely unsatisfactory state of affairs today with respect to the financial sector. This has to be fixed. But the three things the government needs to fix it, I think, are take three important decisions fast. One, to what extent are we going to use the reserves of the Reserve Bank of India and other capital receipts of the central government to plug this financial hole? Second, going forward, since ultimately the burden falls on the taxpayer, we need to decide going forward that if there are regulatory failures such as we have seen over the last 5 or 6 years, ultimately that responsibility is joint between the central government and central bank. Who pays? Does the central bank pay? Does the government of India pay, or something else? Right? That division of labor needs to be there. And third, we need to really come up with, I think, a much better framework that specifies what the major owner of the financial sector in India, which is called the government of India, what its responsibilities as an owner are and what its responsibilities as a regulator are. This is long overdue. I know it's very tempting not to touch this, very tempting. I doubt I'd have the, the statesmanship to touch this myself if I was in power. It is very seductive. But I think there is the capacity for statesmanship going forward given the mandate, and I would sincerely hope that this is a priority of the government on the fiscal and monetary front. On the current account front, I think we are doing rather well. I do not think we need to worry too much. We need to make sure we don't take knee-jerk actions when things like oil prices go up and down, and we need to have a framework which tells us how do we manage when oil prices are $70 a barrel, how do we manage when oil prices are $100 a barrel. More broadly, therefore, what that means is I need more SOPs in managing the macroeconomy of this country and less discretion. At the moment, we are managing this country with annual budgeting, with insufficient, we need to start thinking about monetary policy in a more detailed way, with sort of stop and grow actions on credit policy. And this is a historical legacy, nothing to do with BJP or Congress or India or UPA. This has been the case since the day I was born, and I'd like to see it change.
Madhavan, would you agree that annual budgeting exercise should go, as Rathin said?
Yeah, I mean, do you do an annual budgeting of your household income? When you decide to buy a house, do you say, okay, this year I will put so much on EMI, next year I have no clue whether I will be able to put or not? You don't. I'll just add one last thing, which is, I'm coming back to Parliament. The primary job of Parliament is to hold the government to account for its actions. And I would say the burden of this, always, I'm not saying this particular Parliament, will always fall on the opposition. And I hope that they at least learn something from people like the British to say, okay, let's form a shadow government. Let's allocate certain people with certain responsibilities. From day one, you say, okay, we will focus, that's our job. We are a small, clearly there is a 350 with the government and 200 in the opposition, but 200, not an inconsequential number. Let us at least organize ourselves so that we can hold the government to account for its action. Will they do that?
Interesting.
Thank you. Both Mr. Rathin Roy and Mr. Madhavan have shown us the way. I hope the Modi government also listens to the suggestions offered by both of you. Thank you.